still valuable. I mean, I, I am resistant to myself saying this, but I do think it's true. There is value in philosophy as an exercise in thinking, an exercise in thinking about what is real, what is true, uh, and that in order to act uh, freely, in order to act in a way that is going to help us achieve what we actually want to achieve, in order to execute our will, we need to have a grasp of reality, of the truth. And that even if Plotinus in particular uh, seems irrelevant right now, what is relevant is exercising this kind of philosophical thinking, exercising uh, the ability to discern what is real and how our action can be aligned with the real. Uh, so that's all I'm going to say about the topical. Well, for now, that was my point. But let's continue with Aeneid 6, Tractate 8, just a little bit, because there is something interesting here, something I think that is kind of beautiful about what Plotinus thinks freedom is. Um, I I'm going to be a little bit more critical of Plotinus because I'm impatient with him, as I say. The circumstances that we're living through make it difficult to perhaps uh, contemplate these things in with the same extent of um, indifferent reflection that we might. But um, I think that there is something interesting and beautiful about what Plotinus thinks freedom is. And that is that he thinks freedom is self disposal. He says this on 515, and he elaborates on 516. But he begins on 514. It's those 3 pages that I'm looking at. So he says, a cardinal question is, where are we to place the freedom of action ascribed to us? It must be founded in impulse or in some appetite, as when we act or omit in lust or rage or upon some calculation of advantage accompanied by desire. It goes on. But if rage or desire implied freedom, we must allow freedom to animals, infants, maniacs, the distraught, the victims of malpractice producing uncontrollable delusions. And if freedom turns on calculation or with desire, does this include faulty calculation? So if we say that freedom lies in the emotions, rage or desire, then we have to give it to everyone. Why not give freedom to everyone, Plotinus? Why not say that animals are free, that children, infants have some kind of freedom, that maniacs and the distraught have some kind of freedom? Why not say that that's free? Well, Plotinus's reason, again, is going to be that just like in the story of Oedipus, freedom really is only free when it is combined with wisdom, when it's combined with knowledge, when you are able to understand what the consequences of that action will be. Right? An act is inseparable from its consequences, and therefore, if you cannot control the consequences of that act, then you aren't really in control of the act itself. And so, right, the only free act is going to be one that is fully controlled by you. Now, are there any acts in the world whose consequences can be fully controlled? The answer is no, right? For one reason, because at what point do we decide that the consequences of an action are over? Uh, right? We could say that there is an immediate consequence of an act, as when I drop this pencil, it falls. Uh, but, right, I can't ever draw an end to the consequences that follow from an action. So those consequences are inherently and necessarily going to be outside of my control to some extent. Therefore, any action in the physical world is going to be uh, less free, if there's any freedom in it at all, than an act that is confined solely to my mind and my intellect. So for Plotinus, the only true freedom that we're going to have is going to be in thinking and in contemplation. Again, very frustrating, right? So we're saying essentially everything in the material realm is uncontrollable, unfolds according to necessity, and we cannot really change. We have no choice over. Again, right, this is going back to the last chapter, and I think this is also a kind of beautiful, appealing, seductive idea that the way the all soul, the way the pure soul manifests in the world as a unity is as drama. And so Plotinus will say, well, the plague is inevitable, is necessary, and even all the ugliness and horror that is a consequence of, of Oedipus's plague or our virus, all that is inevitable and in some sense good, right? Because it issues from the total organization of the all soul. It issues from the one, and insofar as it is genuinely has authentic being, it is good, right? Drama, war, all of that is part of the organization of being, which is actual and real, and therefore good. It's very difficult to hear that in a time of crisis like this one. But I think we can still, right, think about what Plotinus is saying, why he's saying it. What's the logic behind this? How can we mount a strong critique of this? What's wrong with this idea? Why is freedom something different? And right, maybe we should consider maybe Plotinus is correct, right? That this sort of Stoic idea that in a time, especially like now, the only freedom that you have, the only thing you can really do is, I mean, is to, escape to the mind, right? And the freedom of thinking. As we self-isolate, obviously that's a lot easier to do in some ways. Anyway, so the reason why he thinks that there is no freedom in rage or desire, no freedom for animals, infants, or maniacs, is because freedom has to be unified with wisdom. He says, if freedom turns on calculation with desire, reason in combination with desire, as that couplement of body and soul, does this include faulty calculation? So in other words, like Oedipus, if I calculate, if I use my freedom in conjunction with reason, but I use faulty reason, is that any better than being led by emotion? He says, sound calculation, no doubt, and sound desire, but then comes the question whether the appetite stirs the calculation or the calculation the appetite. So again, the answer is going to be no. Faulty calculation is also absent of freedom. The only time you're free is when you are thinking and thinking correctly. How do I know when I'm reasoning incorrectly? Most likely it's when my reason is stirred by my appetite, by desires, by some bodily impulse. So he says on page 515, we refuse, right in the middle, we refuse to range under the principle of freedom those whose conduct is directed by such fancy of the appetite of the body of desire. The baser sort, therefore, mainly so guided, cannot be credited with self-disposal or voluntary act. Voluntary act is found in self-disposal. Those baser kinds, animals, maniacs, the distraught, don't have freedom because they don't have self-disposal, because they aren't able to retreat into the mind, to dwell in contemplation, where freedom is available. He says, continuing this section, self-disposal to us belongs to those who, through the activities of the intellectual principle, live above the states of the body. Now, I think what I like about the idea of self-disposal is that we can take that idea of self-disposal and remove it a little bit from this strict dichotomy between body and mind. That would not be what Plotinus does, but I think the idea of self-disposal is useful in other contexts. It's an interesting idea. It relates to another thought that Plotinus has that I think is an interesting one, which we'll talk about in a second, which is this idea that real being, authenticity, and right the truth of what we are as people and what anything is found in a kind of self-gathering. That we are a gathering of body and soul, and that our job is to organize that gathering beautifully, right? Remember, beauty is the organizing of matter into form, and that organization is itself a kind of gathering. So how do we gather ourselves together? How do we self-organize? We do this through self-disposal, disposing ourselves to ourselves, reconciling ourselves with the intellectual principle that that gives us animation, that makes us what we are, that gives us the rational principle. Now, what that self-disposal is for Plotinus, and for, I think, any philosopher, well, sorry, not any philosopher, but the philosophers that we've looked at so far, is a kind of contemplation. that to be self-disposed